North Korean tanks are rolling through Seoul, and the President of the United States hangs up the phone without ordering a single American soldier to move. It is June 28, 1950. 3 days earlier, on June 25, approximately 75,000 North Korean troops crossed the 38th parallel in a full-scale invasion of the South, shattering the quiet of a Sunday morning in Korea and sending shockwaves through every foreign ministry on Earth. Secretary of State Dean Acheson convened Blair House meetings. The Joint Chiefs argued over maps, and the United Nations Security Council, meeting without the Soviet delegate, who had been boycotting since January over the refusal to seat Communist China, passed a resolution condemning the invasion. But resolutions do not stop tanks. Harry Truman listened to the arguments for intervention and weighed them against everything else on his desk. A defense budget of roughly $13 billion that he had fought to hold down, a public exhausted by the last war, and his own long-standing instinct that the Korean peninsula sat outside the ring of interests worth American blood. Acheson's own January speech at the National Press Club had drawn the American defensive perimeter through Japan, Okinawa, and the Philippines. Korea was not inside it. NSC 68, the classified blueprint for a massive military buildup to counter Soviet expansion worldwide, sat on Truman's desk unsigned and unfunded. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened and why the real history unfolded differently. But what Truman could not see, what no one in that room fully understood, was that his decision would quietly dismantle a doctrine before it ever had a name. Without American air cover over the Han River crossings, without naval interdiction off the coast, and without the promise of ground forces to stiffen a collapsing defense, the Republic of Korea's army faced the North alone. South Korea possessed no tanks. It had no combat aircraft. Its artillery was limited, its training uneven, and its logistics fragile. The North Korean People's Army, equipped with Soviet T-34 tanks and backed by months of Soviet planning that Stalin himself had approved in April after Kim Il-sung's persistent lobbying, advanced with the confidence of an army fighting a war already won. Seoul fell on June 28th, the same day Truman made his decision. South Korean units fought bravely in places, along the roads south of the capital, at river crossings where engineers destroyed bridges with their own troops still on the wrong side. But courage without material superiority is a slow way to die. By mid-July, the front had dissolved into a series of retreating pockets. By mid-August, organized resistance south of the Nakdong River disintegrated. There was no Pusan perimeter in this timeline, because there was no one coming to hold it. Syngman Rhee, the aging president who had staked everything on his American patron, fled by ship to Japan, where General Douglas MacArthur, supreme commander of Allied powers in occupied Tokyo, reluctantly granted him asylum. MacArthur said almost nothing publicly. Those close to him said he was furious. The Korean peninsula was, for the first time in 5 years, united under a single flag. It was red. The fall of Korea detonated in American politics like a delayed fuse bomb. Senator Joseph McCarthy, who had already been waving lists and making accusations about communist infiltrators in the State Department, saw his influence double overnight. Who lost Korea became the question that consumed Washington through the autumn of 1950 and into 1951, and it was a question designed not to be answered but to wound. Acheson, publicly loyal to his president, but privately seething at a decision he believed was catastrophic, became the Republican Party's favorite target. The fact that his own January speech had excluded Korea from the defensive perimeter was thrown back at him from every direction, stripped of its original context and sharpened into a weapon. NSC 68, the document that might have rewritten American strategy from the ground up, was quietly shelved. Its central argument, that the United States needed to spend vastly more on conventional military power to contain Soviet expansion at every pressure point, now sounded like a prescription for exactly the kind of commitment Truman had just refused to make. The political space for that argument had collapsed. Truman's approval ratings cratered, and by early 1951, it was clear he would not seek re-election. The man who replaced him on the Democratic ticket was swept aside by a Republican wave led by Dwight D. Eisenhower, who campaigned not on sending troops to Asia, but on a platform of strength through strategic deterrence. The message was clear: America would be strong, but it would be strong from a distance. The consequences of that philosophy would reshape the world. But first, they had to reshape the Pentagon. President Eisenhower took office in January 1953, carrying a mandate shaped entirely by Korea's ghost. The American public wanted safety without bleeding, strength without sacrifice. Eisenhower, a man who understood war better than almost anyone alive, gave them what they wanted, and in doing so, foreclosed an entire category of American power. His administration doubled down on nuclear deterrence. The arsenal grew, delivery systems multiplied. The doctrine of massive retaliation hardened into policy. Any Soviet aggression would be met not with infantry divisions, but with atomic fire. Conventional forces shrank accordingly. The CIA, meanwhile, grew enormously. Covert action became the tool of choice for problems that nuclear weapons could not solve. Coups in Iran, operations in Guatemala, quiet funding for friendly political parties across Europe and Asia. The agency became the scalpel where the bomb was the hammer, and between them there was nothing. No doctrine of limited war. No framework for committing ground troops to fight communism in small, distant countries where the stakes were ambiguous and the exits unclear. The Korean War in our timeline had been the bloody laboratory where the United States learned that lesson, learned that you could fight a communist army without triggering nuclear Armageddon, that wars could be contained, that the cost was high but payable. That lesson was never learned, and its absence would be felt most sharply in a valley in northern Vietnam. France had been fighting Ho Chi Minh's Viet Minh in Indochina since 1946, a grinding colonial war that consumed men, money, and political will in roughly equal measure. Paris had been requesting American financial and material support with increasing urgency, and some of that aid had flowed, but it was never enough, and it came with conditions that satisfied no one. By early 1954, French commanders had committed their best forces to a fortified position in a remote valley called Dien Bien Phu, betting that the Viet Minh would break themselves against prepared defenses. They were wrong. General Vo Nguyen Giap dragged artillery up impossible mountain slopes, cut the airstrip, and besieged the garrison for 56 days. Dien Bien Phu fell on May 7, 1954. In our timeline, the French collapse triggered an American debate about intervention that ultimately led to the partition of Vietnam at the 17th parallel and a deepening commitment that would crescendo into the longest war in American history. In this timeline, that debate barely started. There was no containment doctrine demanding action in peripheral theaters. There was no precedent from Korea suggesting that limited ground intervention could work. There was only a nuclear arsenal that could not be used against guerrillas in jungles and a CIA that could fund but not fight. The Geneva Accords of 1954 proceeded differently. Ho Chi Minh's government received authority over a unified Vietnam. There was no partition, no South Vietnam, no dominoes to argue about, because no one in Washington had built the theory that required them to fall in sequence. With Vietnam unified under Hanoi and no American military footprint anywhere on the Southeast Asian mainland, the regional balance shifted decisively. Communist movements across the region gained not just momentum, but legitimacy. The argument that history was moving in their direction became harder to refute when the world's greatest power had twice declined to stop it. Laos and Cambodia fell under heavy Vietnamese and Chinese influence, their internal politics shaped by advisors and arms flowing from the north and west. Indonesia's Sukarno, always a pragmatic nationalist reading the winds, drifted firmly into the communist orbit, calculating that alignment with Beijing offered more than alignment with a Washington that had proven it would not fight for its friends in Asia. There were limits. Britain's counterinsurgency campaign in Malaya, methodical and locally grounded, succeeded in defeating the communist insurgency there, proving that not every domino was destined to fall. But Malaya was the exception that underscored the rule. Japan, feeling more exposed than at any point since 1945, began quietly rebuilding its military capacity beyond what its American-drafted constitution technically permitted. Tokyo's calculation was simple. If the United States would not fight for Korea, it might not fight for Japan. The self-defense forces grew. Defense budgets expanded. A rearmed Japan was not what anyone in Washington or Beijing had planned for, but it was what the logic of abandonment produced. In October 1962, American reconnaissance aircraft discovered Soviet medium-range ballistic missiles under construction in Cuba, and the world lurched toward annihilation. The crisis unfolded along lines familiar from our timeline: the quarantine, the back-channel negotiations, the agonizing 13 days, but the context surrounding it was profoundly different. The United States that faced this crisis had never fought a limited war. It had never tested the proposition that two nuclear powers could clash through conventional proxies without triggering the final exchange. Its military was structured around a single terrible capability: the ability to destroy civilization. Its conventional forces were smaller, its experience with graduated escalation non-existent. President Kennedy, lacking the Korean War precedent that taught his real-world counterpart that brinkmanship could be survived, faced a starker binary than any president should: escalate to nuclear war or capitulate. The middle options, the ones that existed because Korea had proven limited conflict was possible, were thinner here, less tested, less trusted. The crisis resolved. Khrushchev withdrew the missiles, Kennedy quietly removed Jupiter missiles from Turkey, and the world exhaled. But both sides emerged more frightened than in our timeline. The hotline was installed faster. Arms control talks began with greater urgency. And in the classified assessments that circulated through the Kremlin and the White House alike, the same conclusion appeared. The margin had been thinner than anyone wanted to admit, and next time it might not hold. By the mid-1960s, the Cold War had settled into a pattern unrecognizable from the history we know. Southeast Asia was largely communist, but it was not the monolith that American strategists had once feared. The Sino-Soviet split, which in our timeline played out partly through competing influence over Vietnam and other revolutionary movements, here produced open fractures earlier and more violently. Vietnam aligned with Beijing. Laos tilted toward Hanoi. Cambodia played both sides. Indonesia charted its own erratic course. The bamboo curtain was real, but behind it, communist nations quarreled with the same intensity that capitalist ones did, over borders, over trade, over pride. The United States, never having sent its sons to die in Asian jungles, never experienced the social earthquake that the Vietnam War produced in our history. There was no anti-war movement, no campus upheaval, no draft resistance, no credibility gap between government and governed. American culture in the 1960s remained quieter, more conformist, more trusting of its institutions. The counterculture that reshaped music, politics, and social norms in our timeline was muted here, a whisper rather than a scream. Some would call that a better America. Others would note that the pressure valves were missing, that a society which never questioned its government's use of force abroad never developed the antibodies against its misuse. And the world was not safer. It was simply a different kind of dangerous. Two nuclear superpowers stared at each other across a wider ideological divide, armed to the teeth and lacking the hard-won experience of managing crises short of annihilation. Korea had been a tragedy in our timeline, tens of thousands dead, a peninsula divided, a war that ended in stalemate and frustration. But it had also been an education. It taught Washington and Moscow that wars could be limited, that escalation could be controlled, that the space between peace and apocalypse was navigable if you were careful. In this other history, that education never happened. The space between peace and apocalypse remained unmapped, and the two superpowers walked it in the dark, feeling for edges they could not see, hoping the ground beneath them would hold.